I remember the exact moment everything cracked open. I was sitting at my kitchen table, the one Harold and I had eaten breakfast at for 38 years. The morning light was coming through the same window it always did. The coffee was the same brand. The same chipped mug I never threw away because he had given it to me as a joke one Christmas back in 1999. And my hands were shaking in a way I had never felt before. I was holding a plain white envelope, nothing special about it from the outside. Just my name written on the front in Harold's handwriting. His messy, wide, unmistakable handwriting, the kind that always looked like it was in a slight hurry even when he was taking his time. Harold had been dead for 6 weeks. I had already been through the will. I had already sat in that attorney's office with my son Daniel beside me and watched the estate get divided up. I had cried in the car on the way home. I had nodded at the right moments and said thank you, and driven back to a house that felt 6 sizes too large. I thought that was it. I thought we were past the paperwork. But this envelope had been waiting for me the entire time. Inside it was a letter, and photographs, and a document I had to read 3 times before I understood what I was actually looking at. When I finally understood, I sat very still for a long time. Because what I believed about my family, about my son, about my daughter-in-law, about the final year of my husband's life, almost none of it was true. And what Daniel didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that by the time I held that envelope in my hands, I had already started figuring it out. He had pushed me toward the truth himself. Looking back now, I realize that's the thing about someone who thinks they're smarter than you. They always end up showing you exactly where to look. If this story already has your attention, do me one quick favor and hit that like button. It costs you nothing, and it helps me tell more stories like this one. And if you're new here, welcome. I think you're going to want to stay for this one. Let me take you back to before all of this happened. My name is Margaret. Most people who know me well have always called me Peggy. I taught 4th grade at a public school in a mid-sized city in Ohio for 26 years. I retired at 61, which turned out to be one of the best decisions I ever made, because it gave me 3 full years. Real, present, unhurried years, with Harold before we lost him. Harold was a civil engineer. Practical, methodical, and quiet, in the way some men are quiet. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they spend a lot of time thinking before they say it. He kept paper records of everything. He balanced the checkbook by hand well into the age of apps and online banking. He was the kind of man who fixed things before they broke, read manuals cover to cover, and never paid more for something than he had to. We were not rich people. That was what I knew, or believed I knew. We owned a house that was paid off. A 3-bedroom colonial we had bought for less than it was worth, and steadily improved over 30-something years. We had retirement accounts, modest savings, a shared fondness for one big trip per year, and the good sense to be grateful for it. Daniel was our only child. I want to be careful about how I describe him, because what I learned later changes the way I look back at everything, including memories I used to hold with real warmth. But I'll tell you who I believed he was at the time. Daniel was 38 years old. He worked in commercial real estate and had done reasonably well for himself. He lived about 40 minutes from us. For most of his adult life, he was a good son. Not perfect, nobody is, but good in the ways that count. He called regularly. He came for the holidays. He helped Harold with yard work in the summers. He sat beside me through difficult medical appointments without being asked. Then he met Tiffany. I want to be fair to her too, because the picture I had of her at the beginning was genuinely incomplete. When Daniel first introduced her, 2.5 years ago, she was pretty and energetic and laughed easily. I tried to like her. I genuinely did. But there was something underneath all that warmth I could never quite name. Something that felt like she was always calculating the distance between where she was standing and where she wanted to be standing. Harold noticed it too. He didn't say much about it directly. Harold almost never said things directly. But I remember once, maybe 6 months after Daniel introduced her, Harold looked up from his newspaper and said, "She asks a lot of questions about money for someone who just met us." I told him he was being uncharitable. I think about that moment almost every day. They married 14 months ago. Small ceremony. Daniel said they wanted something intimate. Looking back, intimate was another word for very few witnesses. About 8 months ago, Harold started getting sick. Not suddenly. Harold never did anything suddenly. Slowly. A tiredness that didn't lift after sleep. Then a diagnosis that explained the tiredness. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. We had roughly 6 months. We used every one of them. Harold spent a lot of time at his desk in those final months. Writing, organizing, being Harold in the most Harold way possible, making sure everything was in order before he left. I would bring him coffee and he'd look up and give me that small, quiet smile of his and say, "Almost done, Peggy, almost done." I thought he meant the paperwork. He did, in a way. Just not the kind I imagined. Harold passed away on a Tuesday morning in early March. I won't spend long on the grief itself because grief is private, and also because this story is really about what happened after. What I will say is that the house felt wrong the instant he was gone. Not quieter, I expected quiet, just rearranged somehow, like a room where someone has moved all the furniture in the dark, and you keep reaching for things that aren't where they used to be. Daniel came immediately. He was attentive in those first days, drove me to the funeral home, sat beside me at the service, fielded calls from Harold's colleagues and old friends so I didn't have to. Tiffany was there too, visibly pregnant by then, expecting in July, and I made myself be grateful for that. New life arriving as old life departed. That's how families are supposed to work. The attorney meeting was scheduled for 2 weeks after the funeral. His name was Frank Watkins. Harold had worked with him for years. An older man with a quiet second-floor office downtown, the kind that smells like old carpet and paper files going back decades. I had met him twice before over the years, briefly, forgettably, and he had the particular manner of people who handle difficult conversations professionally. That calm that says, whatever you're feeling right now is normal and manageable, and we will get through it. We sat across from him, Daniel and Tiffany on my left, me on the right. He read through the will. It was straightforward, or appeared to be. The house came to me outright. Harold's retirement accounts and investment portfolio, with a total estimated value of around $420,000, were to be divided 60% to me and 40% to Daniel. There were smaller bequests to Harold's sister Ruth and to a local scholarship fund Harold had quietly supported for years, something I hadn't even known about, which made me pause and love him all over again for a moment. I watched Daniel's face during the reading. I have replayed that memory more times than I can count. His expression was polite, attentive, the way you look when you're waiting for something and you're not yet sure if it's going to arrive. When Mr. Watkins finished and asked if there were any questions, Daniel cleared his throat. "Is that everything?" he said. Mr. Watkins looked at him for just a beat before answering. "That is the entirety of the will as it stands, yes." "As it stands," Daniel said. "What does that mean?" "It means as filed." "Is there a specific concern?" "No," Daniel said. "No concern." But there was something underneath the politeness, a thin layer of something I couldn't name in that room. That night, I lay in bed and replayed his question. Is that everything? Not, is everything in order? Not, what happens next? But, is that everything? Like he had been expecting something more. Like he already knew there should be something more. And that was the moment, though I didn't fully recognize it yet, when I wasn't asking the right question. I spent the next week going through Harold's desk. That was partly grief and partly necessity, accounts to close, paperwork to file, correspondence to answer. Harold's desk was exactly as expected. Meticulous, color-coded folders with typed labels. Every paid bill filed by year going back to 1994. The organizational system of a man who trusted order more than memory. But there were gaps. Small ones. Subtle ones. The kind you'd only notice if you were looking at his system the way Harold himself would, with complete precision. 3 folders were labeled with nothing but initials, HRT. One was empty, one held a single page that looked like a bank account summary, but with a balance on it that I didn't recognize and couldn't account for. The third was in the locked bottom drawer. Harold had kept keys on a small hook inside his closet. Two of them I didn't recognize. I set them aside. There was too much else to deal with. 2 days later, Daniel called. "Mom," he said, "I've been thinking, with the baby coming in July, Tiffany and I are looking at houses in the Ridgemont area. It's a great school district." "That is a nice area," I said. "It is, but it's expensive. And with her on maternity leave," he paused, and I noticed the pause the way you notice the half-second before a car stops too quickly. "I was wondering if we could talk about the inheritance, specifically whether it makes sense to restructure things a little." "What do you mean, restructure?" "Look, Dad's gone, Mom. You've got the house, free and clear. You've got income from the retirement accounts. You don't need as much of the liquid assets as a young family starting out does. I thought maybe we could talk about adjusting the split. Informally, you could just gift me more. There are ways to structure it." I heard Tiffany's voice somewhere in the background, faint, but there. I told him I needed time to think about it. I spent the rest of that evening sitting in Harold's chair in his study, which I almost never did. It still smelled like him. I looked at his desk, at the labeled folders, at the locked drawer. Something Harold used to say came back to me. He said it whenever he was working through something complicated, an engineering problem, a home repair, a financial decision. He would look up and say it almost to himself. "Peggy, the thing you're not looking for is usually the most important thing." The next morning, I called Mr. Watkins. He answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Brannick," he said, "I was actually planning to call you this week." That stopped me. "You were?" "Yes. Harold left something with me. He had specific instructions about timing. He asked that I wait a minimum of 4 weeks after the estate reading before contacting you." A brief pause. "It's been 5 weeks now. Are you available to come in?" I drove there that same afternoon. His office was quiet the way it always was. When I walked in, there was a manila envelope sitting on the center of his desk. It had my name on the front in Harold's handwriting. He slid it toward me. "Harold brought this in about 3 months before he passed," Mr. Watkins said. "He was very specific about it. He said, and I wrote it down at the time." He opened his own folder and read carefully. "Don't give this to Peggy at the reading. She'll have enough to deal with. But make sure she gets it. This one is for her to open alone." I looked at the envelope for a long moment before touching it. "Do you know what's inside?" I asked. He hesitated, just slightly. A hesitation that would have been invisible if I hadn't been paying close attention. I helped Harold prepare some of the documents inside. Not all of them. Some of it I know, some of it is between you and him. Should I be worried? He met my eyes steadily. "I think you should be prepared. I think what's inside is going to raise some questions. And when it does, I want you to know that my office is here to help you answer them." I drove home with the envelope on the passenger seat. I set it on the kitchen table. I made coffee. I sat down. I opened it. There were 4 things inside. The first was a letter. 6 pages, handwritten front and back in Harold's script, looser than usual, the way it got toward the end when his hands were tired. I knew immediately this had been written in his final weeks. I didn't read it in order. I'm not sure why. My eyes moved through it the way eyes move through a document when your instincts are already running ahead of your comprehension, scanning for certain words, certain names. I found Daniel's name on page 2. I found Tiffany's name 3 lines below it. I found the word coercion 4 lines after that. I set the letter down. The second item was a stapled document, a printed bank account statement from a financial institution I had never heard of. The balance on it was just under $900,000. I read that number 4 times. The account was held under something called the Brannick Family Trust. I had never heard of the Brannick Family Trust. The third item was a notarized addendum to Harold's will, dated 8 months earlier. It stated that Daniel's share of the investment portfolio was to be increased from 40% to 75%. Harold's signature was on the bottom, but the will that Mr. Watkins had submitted to probate was the original, the 60-40 split. Not this version. Which meant there were two versions of Harold's wishes, and only one of them had ever officially existed. The fourth thing was a photograph. It showed Daniel and Tiffany sitting at a kitchen table I didn't recognize. Across from them was a man I had never seen, middle-aged, slightly heavy, dressed like he had somewhere to be. There were documents spread across the table between them. Harold was not in the photograph. On the back, in Harold's handwriting, this was taken at Tiffany's sister's house. March 12th. I was in the hospital that week. Someone let them in while I was gone. I sat at the table for a long time. The coffee went cold. Outside, birds were doing what birds do in early spring. Completely indifferent to the fact that everything I believed about my family was being quietly taken apart in front of me. I picked up Harold's letter and started from the beginning. He started with an apology. "Peggy, I'm sorry I didn't tell you all of this while I was alive. Some of it I was ashamed of. Some of it I didn't want you carrying while I was still here and still needed you to be okay. But you need to know now, because without this, you could lose everything I worked to protect for you." He explained the trust first. 11 years ago, 2013, Harold had quietly begun setting aside money. Small amounts at first, taken from earnings on a private consulting arrangement he had taken on without mentioning it to me. "Not from deception," he wrote, "but because of something that had happened with Daniel that I didn't know about." In 2014, Daniel came to me with a debt problem. It was serious, over $60,000. He'd made bad investments with a partner I'd never trusted. I paid it. I told him not to tell you because I didn't want you to think less of him. That was my mistake, Peggy. A big one. Because paying it didn't change how he thought about money. It just told him I was a place to go when he ran out. There had been more in 2017. Another $30,000. A business deal that collapsed. One Harold had been asked to backstop quietly, and foolishly agreed to, again without telling me. And then Tiffany. I want to be fair to her because I think she grew up without much, and I think that can make money feel like safety in a way that overrides other things. But Peggy, she started asking me questions about the estate within 4 months of meeting Daniel. Not obviously, carefully, the way someone asks when they have thought about it a lot and practiced how to make it sound casual. Harold wrote that about 6 months before his diagnosis, Tiffany had started gently suggesting that he and I needed to modernize our estate documents. She recommended an attorney, not Mr. Watkins, someone named Gerald Haas. Harold had agreed to one meeting. I walked out of that meeting understanding 2 things. 1, Gerald Haas was not a real estate attorney, whatever Tiffany called him. He worked in a gray area I recognized immediately and didn't trust. 2, the documents he wanted me to sign would have effectively removed your access to most of the liquid assets after my death and rerouted control of the distribution to Daniel. I didn't sign anything. I told him I needed more time and I left. But then Harold got his diagnosis. And somehow, he wrote that he never fully determined how. Tiffany had seemed to know before he had told anyone but me and the doctor. The week after I told you, Daniel called asking if we could revisit the estate planning conversation. I said no, but the calls kept coming. And then the visits. The visits to the house. The ones when I had been at my sister Carol's for the weekend. I'm not proud of what happened during those visits, Peggy. I was tired. I wasn't thinking as clearly as I used to. There were 2 afternoons, September and October, when I was alone in the house with Daniel and a man I didn't know, and documents were put in front of me. I was told they were insurance paperwork. My reading glasses were in the other room. I trusted my son. The notarized addendum. Harold had signed it without understanding what it was. 3 weeks later, I realized what I had put my name on. I called Watkins immediately. He told me the addendum had no legal standing, as long as it was never filed as the controlling document, and that as long as the original will remained on record, there was nothing they could do with it unless they tried to formally contest, at which point the full story of how it was signed would become part of the public record. And then Harold explained the trust. He had established it in his mother's maiden name, Brannick, 11 years ago. The consulting income he had set aside, invested carefully and quietly for over a decade, had grown to just under $900,000. "It is yours, Peggy. Every dollar. I never took from it. I told myself for years it was a safety net. Looking back, I think I always knew I was building it for something. I just didn't know what. Watkins knows the transfer process. All you have to do is ask him. It's already yours. It always was." He ended the letter simply. "I loved you for 40 years and I would have loved you for 40 more. I'm sorry I waited until I was gone to tell you the truth about things I should have told you years ago. Please trust Watkins. Please don't let them take what isn't theirs to take. And please don't be too angry at Daniel forever. I think he loves you. I think he just lost his way, and I think part of how he lost it was because I kept protecting him from consequences he needed to face. That's on me. But you, Peggy, you are far stronger than either of us ever gave you credit for. I've always known that. Harold," I finished the letter. My face was wet and I couldn't remember when I had started crying. I did not call Daniel. The first thing I felt, once the initial shock settled, was something I can only describe as terrible clarity. The kind you get when a room you've been navigating in the dark suddenly gets lit, and you see that none of the furniture was ever where you thought it was. I thought about Daniel as a little boy, his baseball glove, the way he fell asleep in the back seat on long drives, how Harold had stood straight and proud at his college graduation, with his hands clasped behind his back, trying to hold in how much it meant to him. And then I thought about my son, sitting across from an unknown man at his sister-in-law's kitchen table, with paperwork spread out that was designed to take money from his sick and failing father. I held both of those things at the same time, for a long time. It was one of the hardest things I have ever done. The next morning I called Mr. Watkins, and we spent 2 hours in his office. He walked me through the transfer process for the trust. He also explained my options regarding the fraudulent addendum. If Daniel attempts to contest the original will using that document, Mr. Watkins said, he has a serious problem. The addendum was prepared outside proper legal channels. The notarization itself has procedural deficiencies. And more importantly, Harold prepared a separate signed statement 4 months before he died, explicitly describing the circumstances of how that document was signed and disavowing it. That statement has been on file with my office. I stared at him. Harold wrote a separate statement? He came in specifically for that purpose. Mr. Watkins paused. He was thorough, Peggy. He thought of almost everything. He recommended I speak with a colleague of his, an attorney named Linda Marsh, who specialized in elder financial abuse and estate fraud. He suggested I let her review the full contents of the envelope before I made any other decisions. I said yes. Linda was sharp and direct in a way I immediately trusted. She had the manner of someone who has seen the worst that families do to each other and has not become cynical about it, just clear-eyed. When I walked her through everything, she listened without interrupting, made precise notes, and when I finished, she looked at me and said, "What you've described follows a pattern we see with uncomfortable frequency. An identified beneficiary, usually with financial pressure or a calculating partner, establishes influence over an elderly or ill person during a window of vulnerability, then uses that window to fraudulently alter estate documents." "Do you think Daniel understood what he was doing?" I asked. She considered that for a moment. "I think the documents were prepared with intention. Whether your son fully grasped the legal exposure he was creating for himself, or whether the primary driver was his wife, I can't tell you today. But I'll tell you what I can tell you. The photograph you have is significant. The man at that table is important. Do you have any idea who he is?" I didn't, but I was going to. Linda worked with a private investigator named Dave. She described him as someone who was very good at finding information that people had tried to make invisible. When he came into Linda's office to meet me, he was quiet and unhurried and looked at the photograph for about 10 seconds before setting it down. "Give me a few days," he said. While I waited, I maintained as much normalcy as I could manage. Daniel called twice that week. Both times, the conversation eventually circled to the inheritance. Each time he framed it differently, first as a gift, then as an informal loan, then as an advance on what would naturally come to him eventually anyway. Each conversation had a quality I can only describe as rehearsed, like he was working through options that had been prepared in advance. I was careful with him, I was kind. I said things like, "I need more time," and "I'm still processing everything," and "let's talk again after the baby comes." Each time I hung up, I sat with the complexity of it. I wasn't angry in the way I expected. I was more sad. The kind of sad that settles in when you understand that someone made a choice, not a mistake. A mistake is something that slips. A choice is something a person decides. Dave called on a Thursday. "The man in the photograph is named Phil Sayers," he said. "He runs a document preparation service out of the Dayton area, not a licensed attorney. He's had 3 complaints connected to him over the past 6 years, not filed against him directly since he doesn't carry a law license, but attached to attorneys who worked adjacent to him on disputed estate cases. He was also named in a civil suit in 2019 in Claremont County, estate fraud involving a deceased widow. The case settled out of court." "So he's done this before?" I said. "More than once by the looks of it. He's careful. He positions himself just inside the line of what's technically prosecutable." Dave paused. "But here's the part I think you need to hear. I found a connection between Sayers and Tiffany's work history. About 4 years ago, before she met Daniel, she worked as an administrative assistant at a financial services firm in the Columbus area. That firm was connected to one of the estate situations where Sayers appeared." The room shifted around me. "Are you saying she knew him before she ever met my son?" "I'm saying they had a professional connection before she met Daniel. What that means in practice, I can't tell you for certain, but it's not a coincidence I'd ignore." I set the phone down after we hung up and sat very still for a long time. The word targeted moved through me like a cold current underwater. I ran the timeline in my mind. Tiffany meeting Daniel, the early questions about money, the ones Harold had noticed. The gradual relationship with Harold and me, the warmth that I had always sensed something beneath. The recommendation of Gerald Haas, the visits to the house during the weeks Harold was weakest, the unknown man, Phil Sayers, at the kitchen table with documents spread out. And then Daniel's question in Mr. Watkins' office. Is that everything? He hadn't been asking whether the will was complete. He had been asking whether we had found the trust. I had a plan. Linda had a plan. It was careful and methodical, and Harold would have recognized himself in it. We were going to let Daniel make the next move. If he formally contested the will using the fraudulent addendum, we would meet him in a legal arena where our documentation was overwhelming. If he didn't, we would complete the trust transfer, move on with our lives, and allow the Attorney General's office to handle Sayers independently. The plan was good. The plan changed when Daniel showed up at my door on a Saturday morning without calling first. Tiffany wasn't with him. He was alone. He looked like he hadn't slept well, which I noticed, and which caused an involuntary pull of maternal concern even then, even knowing what I knew. I think that's something no amount of evidence fully removes. He was still my son. I let him in. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table and he looked at me for a moment before he spoke. "Mom," he said, "I need to be honest with you." I waited. Dad and I had conversations toward the end that He stopped, looked at the table, started again. "The will as it was read doesn't reflect what he and I actually discussed. He told me he was going to make adjustments, for the baby, to make sure we had what we needed to get started. He specifically said the split wasn't staying at 60-40. He looked up at me. "I have a document, Mom, a signed document from Dad." I brought it. He put a folder on the table between us. I looked at it. I did not touch it. "When did he sign this?" I asked. "Last fall, when you were at Aunt Carol's." A silence settled over the kitchen. "Daniel," I said, "I need to tell you something." And I told him about the letter. Not everything, not the trust, not Sayers, not what Dave had found. Just that Harold had left a second letter. that Harold had described those autumn visits to the house. That Harold had been explicit, in writing, witnessed by his attorney, about what he had and had not understood when he signed documents during those visits. Daniel went very still. The kind of still that isn't calm. The kind that happens when something internal suddenly stops working. That's not... He stopped himself. Dad didn't say that. He wrote it, I said quietly, in his own hand. It has been on file with Mr. Watkins for months. Silence. Tiffany just... He started, caught himself. His jaw tightened. We just wanted to make sure the baby was provided for. That's all any of this was. We weren't trying to... By presenting documents to your father when he was dying, I said, without his reading glasses, without his attorney present, and without telling me. I didn't know all the details of what Phil was. He stopped. He realized, in that same instant that I heard it, what he had just said. Phil. The name landed in the air between us. Who is Phil? I asked. He looked at me, and I watched something move across his face. The specific expression of someone who has just understood the distance between where they thought they were and where they actually are. A friend of Tiffany's, he said. Nobody. A friend of Tiffany's who prepared the document sitting on this table, I said. He didn't answer. A friend of Tiffany's who she knew before she ever met you, I said, from the Dayton area. The color left his face slowly, the way it does when something doesn't rush out but simply drains. I want to say this clearly. I was not angry sitting across from him. I was heartbroken, but I was also completely steady, steadier than I had felt in months, in a way I hadn't expected. Like grief had burned away whatever in me could still be knocked off balance. Daniel, I said, I love you. I have loved you since before you were born, and nothing that has happened changes that. But I need you to understand something. I paused. Your father protected me. He protected me very carefully, very quietly, over a very long time, and what he built for me, you were never going to find it, because he knew you were looking. Daniel sat without speaking. His hands were flat on the table. Finally, he said, very quietly, she told me it was just paperwork, that it was what Dad would have wanted anyway, that he was too confused at the end to update things properly on his own. He looked at the table. She said we were helping him do what he meant to do. Did you believe that? A long silence. I wanted to believe it, he said. That's not the same thing. I know it's not the same thing. I don't know what I expected from that moment. Maybe more defiance, maybe more denial. What I got instead was something quieter and sadder than either. The look of a person who had been telling himself a story for a long time and had just heard it read back to him in someone else's voice. I need to stop for just a second here. If you've been watching this long, I want to ask you, what would you have done in that moment? Would you have been able to stay calm? Would you have said more or less? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one of them. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Because what happened in the weeks after Daniel left my kitchen that day is where this story really finishes. Daniel left without the folder. He simply stood up, looked at it for a moment, and walked out. I don't know whether leaving it was a decision or whether he just forgot it, but either way, I gave it to Linda that afternoon. The weeks that followed were some of the most complicated of my life, in every direction at once. Linda filed a formal report with the State Attorney General's office regarding Phil Sayers, connecting him to the Claremont County case from 2019, 2 additional complaints, and now the documented pattern of his involvement in Harold's estate. The coordinated picture was clear enough that investigators opened a formal inquiry. I was told it would take time, these things always do, but it had begun. As for the fraudulent addendum, Linda presented the full package to probate court. Harold's letter, his separate signed statement, Mr. Watkins' documentation, the procedural deficiencies in the notarization itself. The court found the addendum invalid on multiple grounds. Daniel did not contest the ruling. I believe this was partly because contesting would have required him to testify openly about Sayers, about Tiffany's prior professional connection to him, about the visits to the house during Harold's final weeks. Territory that had become legally dangerous in ways he may not have fully understood when he first walked onto it. I also believe, and I choose to believe this, that some part of my son was still capable of recognizing when something had gone far enough. The Brannock Family Trust transferred to an account in my name on a Thursday in late May. I sat in the bank with the paperwork and I felt Harold so strongly that it was almost physical. His methodical nature, his quiet foresight. The way he had thought 11 years ahead and never said a word about it, because that was simply how Harold did things. You built the foundation before you told anyone you were building. $912,000. Built over 11 years from consulting work he had done on evenings and weekends. Work he had done without a fuss, without asking for recognition, without even telling his wife, because he was the kind of man who prepared for the thing you couldn't see coming yet. Almost done, Peggy. Almost done. He hadn't been finishing the paperwork. He had been finishing the protection. Phil Sayers was formally charged with elder financial fraud and operating as an unlicensed legal practitioner. He eventually pleaded guilty to a reduced charge, 2 years of probation, a significant fine, and a permanent bar from document preparation services. It was less than he deserved, but it closed a door he had walked through more than once, at the expense of families who trusted their children. Tiffany's situation was more complicated. There was not sufficient documented evidence to bring criminal charges against her directly. Her role was facilitation, and her connection to Sayers, while documented, didn't rise to the level required for prosecution. In the civil motion connected to the estate proceedings, Linda recovered our legal costs in a way that was at least partial and at least symbolic. It was not everything I might have hoped for, but the world found out what she was, and sometimes that is its own kind of consequence. As for Daniel and Tiffany, they are still together. Their son was born in July. I know this because Daniel called me on the day. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't explain or apologize or circle back to any of it. He just said, quietly, "Mom, you have a grandson." I held the phone for a long time after we hung up. I didn't know then what I know now about the specific kind of forgiveness required when the person who hurt you is also someone you grew in your own body and raised with everything you had. It isn't a feeling. It's a decision you make repeatedly, on ordinary days, when the feeling keeps going in the other direction. I haven't forgiven Daniel completely. I may not, in the full sense, for a long time. But I met my grandson 3 weeks later. And he has Harold's eyes. Those exact same steady gray eyes that used to look at me from across a breakfast table for 38 years. And something in me that had been clenched tight for months. Just let go. Not everything, but enough. Enough to take a breath and be a grandmother to a child who had nothing to do with any of it. Mr. Watkins sent me one final piece of correspondence a month after the trust transfer. It was a copy of an email Harold had sent him during his last week, the week he was in the hospital, the week someone had been at the house with documents on the kitchen table. It was short. "Frank, make sure she opens the second envelope before she makes any decisions about anything. She'll know what to do with what's inside. She always knows what to do. I just didn't always tell her enough. Harold." I keep a printed copy of that email in the same drawer as his letter. I think about what it means to spend 40 years with a person and discover, only after they're gone, that they saw you more clearly than you ever saw yourself. That the quiet preparations they made, the patience and the foresight and the care, were their own kind of love language, written not in words but in deeds nobody witnessed. I think about my son, about how money, the desire for it, the fear of not having enough of it, the stories we tell ourselves to justify what we do to pursue it, can erode something in a person, slowly and completely, without them ever noticing the erosion. I think about Tiffany, about how sometimes the damage people cause isn't born from cruelty as much as from a hunger that was never properly addressed, that became a compass pointing in one direction regardless of what stood in the way. I think about the version of this story where I never got that call from Mr. Watkins, where the second envelope sat in a file drawer somewhere, unopened, where Daniel filed a formal contest with the fraudulent addendum in hand, and I had nothing but my own confusion to fight back with. Harold thought of that version. He prepared for it for 11 years. He just refused to let it be the one that happened. I moved the kitchen table to a different spot last month. I don't know why I waited so long. I moved it so the afternoon light comes through now instead of the morning light, and I sit there differently, less like I'm waiting for something to arrive and more like I'm already in the middle of something that's going well. I still make coffee in the same brand, Harold's brand. Some things you keep. Some things, the ones that were built from fear or from someone else's story about who you were, you let go. And some things, the true things, the things that were always there waiting patiently, you simply finally open. Thank you for being here for this whole story. If it reached you somewhere, if it made you think about the people who quietly protect you without announcing it, or about the choices you've made, or the ones you might face, please leave a comment. I read every single one, and if there is someone in your life who might need to hear something about protecting what they've built, share this with them. If you're new here and you made it all the way to the end, welcome, and genuinely thank you. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. These stories take real time to put together, and every subscriber means more than you know. Take care of yourselves, and take care of the people who love you quietly. Until next time.